The sort of rapport and just the presence of being in person adds a lot of value to it in and of itself that you really have to over deliver to compensate for on a webinar platform. You're still there live, but it's not in person. There's not the proximity element of it. So you have to deliver that much more value to be able to keep someone's attention. There's also obviously the reality that when you're engaging in a webinar, you're probably in a room that has other distractions in it, as opposed to being in a presentation room where you're pretty much just focused on the presenter. And so you have to do things throughout that maintain engagement over webinars that you don't on an in-person presentation.
Are you curious about using webinars to attract clients? How do you get started? What's the right path for you and your firm? Paul Yokabitus is our guest this week. He's the founder of Cary Estate Planning and Planwell Legal, where he practices estate planning. Paul took what was looking like a disastrous downturn at the start of the pandemic and has turned it into a well-oiled client acquisition machine using webinars and lead gen advertising. Paul and I will discuss how you can use webinars to attract the best possible clients for your firm and how to get them signed up for your services. Paul details his journey into using webinars, how long it took him to get up and running, and his iterative optimization process. We cover reasons why your in-person presentations might not correctly translate for the webinar format. We'll get into the nuts and bolts of webinars, how to engage with the audience, how to time your webinars, how to experiment with formats and leads, and perfecting your CTAs at the end. We'll even get into differentiation tactics that you can separate all those leads into. This episode is full of widely applicable tips that can be used for all sorts of practice areas, and I think you'll really be interested in hearing about it. Let's get into it. I'm John Strohmeyer, and this is the 5-Star Counsel Podcast. The market for legal services is shifting, and lawyers who don't adapt will be left behind. This podcast gives you a competitive edge in today's market by sharing the client service lessons you probably didn't learn in law school or in law practice. Let's start the show. This episode of 5-Star Counsel is sponsored by Text Expander. Supercharge your team with the power of Text Expander. Now, I've been using Text Expander for years, and it's a huge help. I save hours every week by using the snippets to consistently generate pre-written text for communications. This saves me from being lashed to the keyboard, coming up with the right words, and then typing them correctly. I've typed it correctly once, so it's ready whenever I type the short abbreviation I chose. Text Expander does the rest of the typing for me. Now, I started using text replacement years ago to streamline and speed up my time entry. I had a few snippets that included most of the words that I needed for any entry. I'd enter that snippet and then delete the words I didn't need. The best part was not having to type the same phrases over and over again. Telephone conference with, office conference with, preparation for same, and on and on and on. I'm sure you've got the same stock phrases that you can type blindfolded and don't care to ever think about again. Ultimately, it means you can do more with the same resources. Less repetition, fewer errors, and greater consistency. Text Expander is available on Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad, so you can use your snippets across your programs and platforms. For example, I can respond to a LinkedIn message on my phone, iPad, or desktop with one Calendly link, and all I have to remember is my custom abbreviation. 5-Star counselors can get 20% off their first year by following the link in the show notes or heading to 5starcounsel.com/textexpander. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, John, I appreciate you having me.
I met you for the first time at Max Law earlier this year, and you gave a talk on both, combined talk on Facebook ads as well as how you used webinars to really make the most of the pandemic starting, 18, 20, whatever months ago. And I think this is a really important thing of, figuring out where your clients are. How do we make sure the right clients are getting in? And how do we make it easy for them to go through the process before we even start doing the work? Because ultimately, it's not just about can we get people in, it's can we get the right people who want to do the work or want us to do the right work for them. You have clearly figured out a few things on this, and I'm going to, start by handing it off to you before we jump more into webinars and kind of positioning generally.
Yeah, and the pandemic did a lot of things for a lot of different industries, some positive, some negative, but I think it presented opportunities to really deep dive into your own processes and sort of reevaluate how consumers are engaging in, approaching, or sort of like taking the first step into the service that you provide. And so we obviously did that primarily from the estate planning side. My primary, profession is as an estate planning attorney. And, I opened a firm back in 2018 in Cary, North Carolina. And so the opportunities for planning obviously were significant in the beginning of the pandemic because a lot of people were worried about the what happens after I'm gone question, right? They wanted to make sure that they were protected and that their legacy was preserved and wishes known. But we had this immediate check on availability of sort of saying, well, nobody's allowed to leave. And so how do we make that sort of information and service approachable? And so we had, prior to the pandemic, much like a lot of other estate planning lawyers, done in-person workshops, just sort of go to a community center or a library or a restaurant or whatever the most appropriate venue is to speak about the topic that you provide services for clients. And so, the issue with the pandemic is pretty much everything was closed. And so we as a firm had to reevaluate how we were marketing generally. And the, I guess, obvious opportunity was to continue to still do presentations, but in a different medium, one that would be more accessible and one that would not be geographically limited like an in-person, event would be. And so we started exploring it and, we started realizing how versatile of a tool it could be. And we sort of made the initial investments and then scaled it from there. And, as they say, the rest of it is history.
So let's start, I guess, from the beginning. If everything shut down middle of March last year, how long do you think it took for you not to get good at webinars, but to get, up and running on your webinars?
Yeah. The minimum viable product. Yeah.
Or even the minimum product, even if it wasn't viable.
Right. Well, the unfortunate timing of it all is that I actually had in-person workshops booked for a senior center in Cary for, I think it was like Thursday and Friday of a week. And then everything shut down that Wednesday. So I had basically pending appointments with a bunch of people who are confirmed that we're going to attend. And then basically the county and the state shut everything down. So our first iteration of webinars was actually sort of a lackluster, what can we do in 24 hours sort of proposition. And it was merely, we had all of these emails and names of people who had signed up who were going to attend this in-person opportunity. And so we basically just did a blast email to this entire list and invited them to a Facebook group. And it was a private Facebook group. And we were basically just going to use the live presentation feature within the group itself. And we were getting these leads from Facebook. So we knew that Facebook was a medium that they were comfortable with. So we basically were just like, well, we're already there. Let's just try to figure it out. So we did these live presentations within the group and they did not work very well. They were passable, right? We weren't able to really do like a call to action. There wasn't really any like baked in follow-up or any sort of like, replay that was being sent out or anything like that, like you would have in a traditional webinar campaign these days. But what it really allowed us to do is not totally lose all of the investment and effort that we had used for that March campaign. It allowed us to sort of keep those leads engaged and then basically invite them back in April when we actually had retooled everything to be more of a proper webinar, which then allowed us, we shift to a platform called Demio. And we've been on Demio ever since.
So, I mean, just picking up on the things that you weren't doing, it sounds like you just went in, you probably just took the normal talk you would have given as an in-person seminar and said, oh, this will be easy enough. I've got a camera built into my laptop. I've got a microphone built into my laptop. What could go wrong without adapting to the medium?
Correct. Yeah. And exactly. All stock, it's just a very quick pivot to the content, the presentation that we were already giving, which, looking back, our in-person presentations are vastly different than our webinar presentations. And it's usually, because of the tools that you can use in webinars that you can't in person, the lack of face-to-face connection. It's just a different presentation medium. It all seems the same to sort of the inexperienced, marketer, but they're vastly different. I mean, you can't prepare for in-person the way that you prepare for webinars. So yeah, and that was sort of that began the reevaluation process of the way that we were doing things, the way that we were presenting it to live video audiences. And we've made a lot of incremental shifts over time. It's not one of those sort of set it and forget it, dial it in and then it's perfect forever. We're constantly changing things every month. And it's largely just having an eye on, what's working, what isn't, trying to do some A/B testing and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was very just thrown together back in March of 2020. April was really the same. because we hadn't pivoted content yet. So it's still the same type of presentation, just with a more effective delivery and a more effective follow-up. But we didn't really change the content for a couple months. And it was largely because of realizing it wasn't really working that well.
Interesting. So as you look back now, what would be the one thing you wish you knew when you started about that content delivery? Not the follow-ups or the calls to action, but just in content delivery that made the biggest, what do you wish you'd known sooner?
I think that most of what I have learned in terms of like the tactics of presentation delivery has been by attending different presentations and webinars. And you sort of see, I think there's sort of like the stereotypical on-demand webinar that, people sign up for the free code or the free download deliverable or whatever, that's sort of like a rinse, wash, and repeat kind of thing. But you see the common elements that people are hitting in those types of webinar presentations that are not there for in-person presentations. There's still usually an introduction, a content, and then, a call to action, but the way that it's presented is just so different. And so during the pandemic was also when I started kind of engaging more in webinar content and sort of seeing, I'm seeing kind of, common themes of the way that things are presented, the way that, slides, for instance, are used in an in-person setting versus over webinar can be vastly different. Do you script it all? Do you just use talking points? I mean, there's different pros and cons to different ways of presenting, but you can sort of see the sort of rapport and just the presence of being in person adds a lot of value to it in and of itself that you really have to over deliver to compensate for on a webinar platform. You're still there live, but it's not in person. There's not the proximity element of it. So you have to deliver that much more value to be able to keep someone's attention. There's also obviously the reality that when you're engaging in a webinar, you're probably in a room that has other distractions in it, as opposed to being in a presentation room where you're pretty much just focused on the presenter. And so you have to do things throughout that maintain engagement over webinars that you don't on an in-person presentation. And it's just I think an awareness of the client perspective rather than sort of getting wrapped up in the presentation itself or the, I'm the smartest in the room, I got to show them how smart I am kind of thing. That I think is where a lot of lawyers go sideways, where they lose the effective quality of their presentation.
Interesting, because it makes me think when we're talking about adapting to webinars, obviously, look, I listen to a lot of podcasts. That is something that I do while doing something else usually. Like I got up this morning, went for a run, listening to podcasts, working around the house, cooking. It's something I'll have on in the background. And it seems like the webinar was probably going to be the same way. I know I've done a few webinars that way where I'm doing something else, kind of picking up bits and pieces. And if it makes sense, I'll rewind. So it makes sense that we need to adapt to where our clients are, to draw them in more, to knock them loose so that they'll actually pay attention to it. Have you also thought about, before you'd probably do an hour-long in-person seminar, because look, they were there, they may have been on their phone, but at least they were right in front of you. Have you altered the length of the webinar?
Yes. Yeah, the in-person presentation was usually an hour to an hour and 15 minutes or so. And I try not to go any longer than like 40 minutes on a webinar. But you kind of spoke to something too, is like, I think with podcasts, the expectation is to not be engaged as a listener. It's just to passively listen, right? And so I think that that's easy to do with a webinar too, if the presenter allows you to be passive. And so that's sort of part of creating a good webinar presentation is creating opportunities for engagement immediately, right? And so you're sort of setting the expectation for how the webinar is going to go. And that's essentially telling the viewer or the audience member of whether they can be passively engaged or whether they have to actually pay attention. And I think that's part of a good webinar is meaningful interaction and engagement with the actual audience. Whereas, you're going to get that through a presentation, just through like, raise your hand if you have an estate plan or something like that, right? You can do sort of like that immediate interaction just by, moving your hand or saying yes or whatever. But how you do that in a webinar is different because, with Demio, for instance, we're not seeing the audience. There's no two-way, camera. So the interaction that we do is basically asking for people to communicate through the chat or to participate in polls or, different things. And we've tried different mechanisms, but it's usually polls that will hold attention a little bit longer because they're actually being asked to make a decision, not just to sort of, be present. And so I think that's the issue with a lot of lawyers with creating webinar content is they're really just creating it more like a podcast and less like an actual like workshop or something that's worthy of being engaged with.
That's really interesting. And I mean, it comes back to something we've talked about here a few times, the IKEA effect,
Yeah.
where you value something more if you've helped create it. And
Yep.
I've got a client meeting later today. We will spend an hour and a half to 2 hours talking about their plan, but it's not just talking about it. We'll be sharing screens. We'll have stuff up on, they'll see us, they'll see my associate typing and kind of moving the boxes around to make sure we've identified who gets what and how it flows to different places. So even if they're not necessarily dragging the mouse around, they're doing it and seeing it be created in front of them.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand that none of this is like absolute. Like there's never, definitive rules that apply to everybody. I think that's a big concept in, how you structure a client experience within a professional planning, practice, or how you structure marketing materials is what works for you may not work for me, and what works in March may not work in April. And so it's always this sort of constant iteration and A/B testing to sort of see, well, we have these assumptions about what a general audience would like, but you have to try to figure out what your audience actually likes. Like I have a marketing company that basically helps attorneys like us create and deliver webinar campaigns, and generally Facebook ads, any sort of Facebook ad campaign. But we have very clear data that shows what works in the Raleigh market does not work in the Miami market. Like we clearly have two estate planning firms, my firm and then another firm of a client of ours. The markets are just different on when they prefer to engage in that sort of content. Like mine work really well at like 6:30 p.m. on a Monday, and we see that repeatedly month over month over month, and it's sort of bankable at this point. But the firm that we work with in Miami, their sweet spot is 11 a.m. And if I ran him at 11 a.m. in Raleigh, I'd have crickets. But he runs 6:30 and he gets crickets, right? It's sort of, what works for me in my market may not work for you in your market. And so you can't necessarily just be wed to what the industry says will work. You have to kind of try different things and not just be wed to legal either. Like take, strategies or indications from other, adjacent or complementary industries like financial advisors, like professional consulting. What do they do? How could we take that to be, more aligned with the legal marketing aspects of it?
Interesting. Yeah, because what you're getting at is we've got to figure out what works for us. It's easy to always say, well, special pleading, this only works for me and you wouldn't understand. But the harder part is experimenting enough and trying enough different things to figure out that 6:30 on Mondays is your sweet spot. So this is probably something you didn't, at this point, because you're doing this A/B testing, because you're, trying different things against each other at the same time, how are you setting up your experiments even on a going forward basis? Is it at just every Monday at 6:30 and then you've got to be trying something else against that?
Yeah, and I think that's the point, is to not put your eggs in all the eggs in one basket when it comes to A/B testing. Is you sort of, I think when you're investigating or investing in new marketing tactics or campaigns, you have to kind of expect it to not be perfect on the first run. And so you're doing a little bit more recon work on your first couple of campaigns to just sort of see where the feelers actually, get hits. But so in that respect, the goal of your early campaigns is not ROI. It is to A/B test and kind of find your sweet spots. And then you basically turn up the dial once you find those sweet spots. But you don't just then say, well, I found it, that's it. You basically sort of find your mainstay, which is sort of your anchor, and then manipulate around the anchor and sort of say like, well, if I know for sure my Monday 6:30s are going to be packed, I can play around with the second one of the week, right? I usually do 2 in a week and then 2 weeks out of the month. So it's usually 4 campaigns. And so I'll generally play around with that second day and time. And so we'll look at like a Wednesday noon or like a Thursday evening or whatever. And we're basically trying to run the data against each other month to month, but also understanding that there's going to be month variance too. Like if I'm running these in July, they're just going to be bad data just because people don't attend webinars in July.
Exactly.
January, right?
January's usually slow for us, but same thing. I know from July 4th until the week before school starts, things drop off and nobody's paying attention. But sure enough, the Monday before Houston Independent School District picks back up, that's when calls just start regularly coming back in and knowing that variance. So to kind of move to the next step, you've got people in, you've gone through your webinar, you've had them engaged. What happens at the end of the webinar? Because you talked about no calls to action and no follow-ups. where are clients or where are the potential clients going after they've sat through your no longer than 40-minute webinar?
Well, and that was sort of the issue is when we started webinars, we had no call to action, no follow up, at least not effectively. Now we have all of that, right? And that's the thing is it's more changing the expectation of what the campaign is supposed to net. And so a lot of people will see that as, your opportunity is to engage with the attendees. So people who attend live, they book a consultation live or not, right? And then they basically lose enthusiasm for the campaign from there. Like they don't realize that there is a lot of value to having these new leads on your list and continuing to, touch them in a valuable way, not in a, spammy, harassing way, but sort of saying like, just wanted to thank you for registering for our event. If you didn't have an opportunity to review it, here's a link to the replay, like those sort of things. Here's some additional information you should consider anytime you're evaluating estate planning options, those sorts of things where they're meaningful, valuable touches. And so we have a very clear call to action now. The call to action is to basically set up a call with our client intake specialist. And the goal is to not just sort of like open up our calendar and say anybody who just so happened to attend a webinar now has free reign to book whatever consultation, date that they want to. We as a firm don't charge consultation fees for estate planning. And it's not because you can't, it's just it's not necessarily in alignment with the market expectation in the Raleigh area, but it also is a natural barrier to entry for anybody who's sort of attending a webinar to sort of say, well, my next step is to pay them $500 to have a conversation, right? It's sort of a non-starter. So instead of doing that, and instead of basically opening the calendar to whoever wants to get on it, we basically have this pre-qualification call. And it is what we call a discovery call. And so our client intake specialist, Sarah, basically will have like these pre-scheduled calls that the webinar attendees are booking directly just through a Calendly link. So that's the call to action is basically your first step is to book a call with Sarah just to see if we can help you figure out what you're looking for, figure out if it's in alignment with our service model, and if it would be a good fit for us to work together. If the answer is yes, then Sarah is going to help them book what we call an initial strategy meeting. And that's sort of setting down and saying, how can we help? What are we actually doing? That's where we're doing a needs assessment, talking about next steps and process and systems and those sort of things, what the expectations are for our clients to be clients, those sort of things. And if it's not a good fit, then we refer them out, whether it's going to be to, maybe it's that they didn't actually need estate planning. Maybe they needed life insurance. Well, we don't do life insurance. So we would refer them to a life insurance agent. Or maybe they are more fee conscious, right? Our Cary estate planning firm is not cheap. We generally provide a very thorough and robust client experience, and that's more relationship centric. We offer what we call our lifetime lawyer model, which is sort of an ongoing relationship oriented planning proposition. And so that's not in alignment with everyone's expectations or everyone's budgets. So we actually created a second law firm about 8 months ago, back in April. And the opportunity there was to create more of an access to planning initiative so that we weren't just sort of saying, sorry, you're not a good fit for Cary estate planning. You're just going to have to figure something else out. We wanted to basically make planning more accessible to more people by providing more of a streamlined, slimmed down virtual planning experience that was still very complete, right? It wasn't, here are some templates and put your name in them. They're lawyer drafted estate plans that are just, we're sort of carving off all of the extras, right? We're just making it a lot more streamlined and basic. And so a lot of people in both demographics will find the webinar and will attend the webinar. And then during this discovery call, we can sort of segment them or redirect them in the way that will make the most sense for them based on their expectations of a planning relationship and their budget. So it's sort of a win-win. We're not, losing, an hour potentially meeting with somebody who would never be able to work with us, but we're also able to give a meaningful conclusion to a planning objective for somebody who otherwise is not a good fit for Cary estate planning. So that's the call to action is really the first step, have the conversation. And then if we sort of decide that it's a good fit, then we, schedule the meeting for the next steps.
Yeah, and this comes to an idea I've probably mentioned here a few times. I've been thinking about it. The book, will include a link, is Positioning for Professionals by Tim Williams. And the part where I circled and put no less than 3 stars on the page and still have it flagged with a paperclip. When you've got these services, what he's getting at is what's the differentiated service? If you can't set yourself apart in the market, you really have 3 options. Option 1, and this sounds like the Cary estate planning model, you're adding value or the value is already there to that service that could otherwise be a commodity, and then you're charging more than just about anybody else, or at least you're charging more for it.
Correct.
Option 2, and I don't think you mentioned the other name for the Cary estate, or for the alternate version.
Yeah, it's called Planwell Legal.
So for Planwell Legal, Williams is saying option 2 is you find a more efficient way to deliver that service, and then you're charging less for it. Why? You're differentiating.
Right.
And you're not polluting the brand of either.
Right.
Again, I worked at the Four Seasons for years. We didn't have the Best Western four-season model. It was the Four Seasons. Looking at other hotel chains where they do have the range of brands, they're letting you pick what you want. And so if you wanted the Ritz, you can go to the Ritz. If you only need Best Western, you can get that, or whatever the appropriate models are within those brands. Option 3, and I think this was one of the better things he put in there, is just stop doing it altogether. Like, if you can't dial yourself in to either the high end or the low end, you need to get out of it, because otherwise you're fishing in the middle of a red ocean where there's no differentiation. Nobody has a reason to pick you other than that you happen to be there.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's we often will use the Marriott or the Toyota model as an example of sort of saying, like, we're providing exceptional quality, but the feel is very different between those two models. And so we often will compare Planwell to like the Courtyard model, where it's very, very straightforward, still nice rooms, but you're not getting really any extras. You're just it's just a decent hotel that's going to meet your objectives for a place to stay, and that's within your budget. Where Cary estate planning is more like a Ritz or a JW, where it's more service oriented, high touch. We have a bigger staff to be able to be super receptive and responsive to all of our clients, so that they're not waiting around, for a week for an answer and that kind of thing. So people, once you sort of use that kind of analogy of sort of saying, well, you offer two different firms, what's the difference? That's usually the analogy we use, and they grasp onto it pretty quickly. They're saying it's sort of no fuss, no muss, straightforward, option for Planwell, where it's a lot more relationship oriented, professional services, ongoing, structured engagement over time. And I mentioned earlier, Toyota versus Lexus, same kind of thing. Honda versus Acura. I think there's a lot of singular companies that have multiple models, that not necessarily in professional services, but in other industries like cars, like hotels, that people can grasp onto. United has sort of like their traditional flight model versus their super discounted fee model. Like, you're not getting the same. It's just a matter of how are you voicing the difference, or how are you explaining the difference to the potential client, and then allowing them to self-select.
Excellent. So as we look to close this interview down, Paul, what is one tip you would leave with our listeners on, building out the funnel, building out these webinars? Where can they get started?
Well, I think the common thread for the now 3 businesses that we've started is that we create everything first with the client's experience in mind. And so we basically sort of, sort through the mess of what the traditional, lawyer does, or what the traditional marketing company does, and sort of say, like, what are the pain points? Like, what sucks about these industries, and how can we redesign them to eliminate the friction points? And so, like with lawyers, they're traditionally super stuffy and unapproachable and very, proper in how they do things, and it's very lawyer centric. So we flip that on its head, and we don't wear suits and ties around the office. We make everything super approachable. We make everything very focused on making sure that the client is always up to date on their matter and those sorts of things. With the marketing company, we focus on clients, not leads. We focus on month-to-month engagement and actually proving value, instead of just doing new client acquisition and signing it up for 6 months and then basically looking for new clients because you can't actually provide good service. So those all have this common thread of being about the client first. And so instead of trying to build this business around my expectations as a professional, I've built them from the ground up with the client experience in mind, and then basically tried to investigate where the industry is lacking and try to set up the model around alleviating those pain points.
Excellent.
That's not unique to anything that I do. This is the story brand model, right?
Right. So, Paul, where can we find you online?
Yeah, so you can check out CaryEstatePlanning.com is our website. You'll see, if you're a fan of the story brand model, our entire website homepage is structured around that sort of messaging. Planwell.legal is our more streamlined estate planning firm, and then DiscoveryLegalMarketing.com is our Facebook ad agency for lawyers.
Great, Paul. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks so much for listening. You can find more info on us and get your free white paper on client service at 5starcouncil.com. You can get in touch with me at john@5starcouncil.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe wherever fine podcasts are found and leave us a review wherever you can.